So what we're going to talk about in this chapter is a question that you're going to get 99% of the time in your interviews, and it's going to be most likely the first question that your interviewer asks. And that question is, tell me about yourself. This also comes in other forms. Walk me through your resume, or what's your background? The purpose of this question is, it's the first question your interviewer is going to ask because they just want to learn more about you. What's your story? Why are you here today sitting in front of them? And this question is crucial to the rest of your interview because your interviewer is going to make an opinion about you within the first 5 to 15 seconds of meeting you. Your answer to this question is ultimately going to confirm or challenge those opinions and assumptions that your interviewer just made about you. And that's why this question is so crucial. If your interviewer thinks you're a go-getter, you're super confident, and you're going to make a great PM, and then they hear your tell me about your story that makes you sound like you're going to be a great PM, you just set yourself up for a fantastic interview. So in this chapter, we're going to go through what you do and don't want to do, some good and bad examples, and then finally some tips so how you can make a killer tell me about yourself. Most people answer this question in one of two ways. The first one is they answer it very logically. They go through their resume, they say what school they went to, they say their internships, they say their responsibilities of their internships, they say their extracurriculars they're involved in, and they make a list. And you know what? That's boring. Nobody wants to listen to that. It's incredibly boring. I've done interviews and I zone out within the first minute because it's just not interesting. You hear the same thing from everyone. Oh, I went to a tier 1 school. I majored in computer science. I did an internship wherever I could get my first summer. My second summer, I was a software engineer at a major tech company. Then I did a PM internship. I may or may not have had my own personal side project. Nobody wants to hear the same story from every single candidate. And those people aren't telling a story. And that's what you do want to do. You want to tell a story. You want it to flow like music. You want it to make sense. Why are you interested in PM? Why do you want to be a PM? What experience led you to sitting in front of the interviewer? And that's what they want to hear about. So let's take a look at what you don't want to do. So my name's Philip, and I'm a junior at the University of Michigan. I majored in business at the Ross School of Business, and I did a minor in computer science. At my first internship, I worked at Juicero, and I had a marketing internship. And while I was there, I was in charge of influencer marketing. I ran personal projects for the CEO, such as making sure custom cups would get delivered to all of our customers who would buy a Juicero. And then I also ran a lot of our social media marketing. After I worked at Juicero, I went to work for Anheuser-Busch's venture capital arm, ZX Ventures. While I was there, it was pretty interesting. I was put on a team with 3 other people. We were given $25,000, and we were given a problem, which was there's a very broken chain of command within beer distribution. The distributor has to sell to, the manufacturer has to sell to the wholesaler who has to sell to the customer, and we build a platform to basically help those problems. And ultimately, that company is still running today. We launched it in the Netherlands, and it got funded by Anheuser-Busch. After that, I really liked working there, so I went back to ZX Ventures, and I did a product management internship on their e-commerce team, where I worked on the same type of product, but in the US this time. And it was really hard. It was harder this time because I had to deal with a lot of legal constraints. And then outside of my internships, I also was director of partnerships for my consulting club, 180 Degrees Consulting, where we consult for nonprofits and social enterprises. And I was responsible for going out and getting all of our clients that we would consult for. In addition to that, I actually ran my own business, importing office products from China, and I would sell them online. And I actually ended up selling that business going into my senior year. So let's dissect that example and what I did. So I start off my education, I go through my internships, and then I talk about what I do in school. It was all very logical. I started a business in my internship, I started a business of my own. It all made sense. I was the ideal candidate. But there was a few issues with that. One, I was super unenthusiastic. That must have been incredibly painful to listen to. I'm not even going to go watch this recording. Next, I didn't really craft a story. There's no reason, we never got to the reason why I wanted to do product management. Why was I sitting in front of the interview? I did 2 internships at ZX Ventures and I didn't want to go back. Why? I left my interviewer with a ton of questions, and it wasn't necessarily questions that he wants to ask. Like, he might ask me, why didn't you go back to ZX Ventures? But why does that answer really matter? But I didn't give him that information. I also went into way too much detail. He doesn't need to know the problem that we started at ZX Ventures for that business during the accelerator. It didn't need to happen. Another point, I didn't really spend that much time talking about my business. That was the most impressive thing. I built and sold a company, but I didn't go that in depth. Why would I spend more time talking about my internships than that? It just doesn't make sense. But ultimately, that's not the answer you want to do. There was no story. I didn't really communicate why I wanted to. It just overall wasn't a very good response. So now let's take a look at what is a good response. I'd love to. Yeah, so my name's Philip. I'm originally from outside Philadelphia, but I went to school at the University of Michigan, where I studied business and computer science. Initially, when I came into school, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to major in. Neither of my parents went to college, so I didn't really have a whole lot of guidance from them. But what I did know coming into freshman year is that I wanted to get an internship in California, and simply because I'd never been there before. I ended up getting really lucky and landed an internship with the infamous startup Juicero. And while I was at Juicero, I had a pretty general internship. But my main takeaway from it was 2 things. One, I found that I absolutely love building products, getting them into the customer's hands. I thought it was the best feeling in the world. And then the other thing I learned was that I really liked working with cross-functional teams, in the sense that I love working with different types of people and being able to work with the sales team, the product team, the engineering team, the finance team, and all these different types of people at Juicero made me really like the idea of being able to work with those different types and not just being in the same team all the time. After Juicero, decided I wanted to do something else, and by chance landed in Anheuser-Busch's venture capital arm, ZX Ventures Internal Accelerator, where I was put on a team with 3 other people. We were given a problem and $25,000 and told to go start a company off this problem. The company we ended up starting, we launched in the Netherlands, and Anheuser-Busch invested money into it, and that company is still running today. Really had a great time that summer, so I went back to ZX Ventures, and I worked on pretty much the same product, but in the United States this time instead of Europe. But I found that I didn't really like ZX Ventures' internal culture, and I wanted to work at a company where the core competency of that company was technology. So now I'm really looking for somewhere where, 1, I'm enjoying what I'm working on, 2, I get to work in a pretty fast-paced environment, and 3, I'm getting to build products and getting them into customers' hands. And then kind of outside of all my professional work, I used to be a sponsored snowboarder that could compete competitively. I was sponsored by Quicksilver. I'm an Eagle Scout. I ran the Detroit Marathon. I used to do stand-up comedy, and I actually started my own business and I sold it going into senior year. So let's dissect that response I just gave. Right off the bat, I was way more enjoyable to listen to. I was pleasant, I was excited, I was just happy to be there. It was a better response overall in the way I communicated it. Next, I told a story. I went all the way from me going into college, figuring out what I wanted to major in, figuring out what I really liked about my first internship and how that led to me to my next 2, how I didn't really enjoy the place I worked at for 2 summers, and then why I want to do product management. And I kept those general themes of why product management throughout the entire time. Next, we can look at something a bit more subtle. In the beginning, I say, and neither of my parents went to college. And why I do that is because ultimately PMs, they take ambiguous situations and they figure out their goal and they hit it. If neither of my parents went to college, that means I figured out what I wanted to major in on my own. I figured out my job that I wanted to do on my own. And it means I'm a self-starter. I'm someone who did that. So it really gets the interviewer on my team right away. Another thing is, I don't lie, but I exaggerate a little. A lot of interviewers you'll have are don't want product managers who aren't technical. So they want you to have a computer science degree. I say I studied business and computer science because if I was to say, oh, I majored in business with a minor in computer science, I don't want interviewers who think you need a CS degree to be a successful product manager, which isn't true, to write me off right away. And that's why I do it. Next, I talk about Juicero, but what I did at Juicero isn't important to being a PM, but what I learned is, and that's why I include it. Two things. The first, I really love it, building products and getting in the customer's hands. And then the next one, working in cross-functional teams. These are two skills you need to be a successful PM, and I bring it up right away. The next, my internship, I include a key skill, which is I start a product from scratch. We take an idea to a business. That's essentially is what you're doing as a product manager, building features off pain points. And that's what we did. So that's why I included that story. The next story and what I did at my third internship, my junior year, is not relevant to my tell me about yourself answer. So don't really include it. But what is relevant is why I don't go back to CX Ventures. And that's why that is included in the story. Then I finally wrap it up with what I'm looking for now, which is a really crucial piece. And then I also include my interest. I include my interest in not only try and connect with my interviewer, which we go in a bit later in my tips section, but I do it to communicate things about myself. Eagle Scout shows I'm leadership, shows leadership. Competitive snowboarder shows I'm competitive. Stand-up comedy shows I can get up and speak in front of a crowd. And then starting and selling my own business. That's just something super impressive, and a lot of product managers have similar side projects like that. Lastly, I include the Detroit Marathon one because one, that was a big personal accomplishment for me, showed me I could do anything myself mind to, but also I've talked to 3 other marathon runners throughout my interviews. So I do that to try and connect with other people. But ultimately, that's what you want to do. And I wrote this out ahead of time, and I included those small details to make this the best answer possible. So now we're going to go into some tips about how you can also craft a killer tell me about yourself answer. So how to actually craft your killer tell me about yourself answer. So the first thing you want to do, we've talked about this already, but is craft an interesting story. What does a story have? It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's what you want to do. Start somewhere logically, tell the progressive story, and the end. You could be saying to yourself, where I go to school and doing my internships in order is a story, but it's not. Because a story has a common theme. It has a common flow. There's the same flow. It all makes sense. And if you have 3 very different internships that don't really matter, then it's not going to be that same story. You don't want to try and force things. For example, my consulting club, 180 Degrees Consulting, where I was director of partnerships, pretty impressive, relevant to being PM, but it's not relevant to my story. And I don't think it's the most impressive thing about me, so I don't include it. You don't need to include everything. And leading into the next tip, practice as much as possible. You want to get your story down every time. You don't want to be winging it, trying something different. You want the same story every time. You want to get it down. You don't want to necessarily memorize it, but you want to memorize pretty much the structure, the flow, how you're going to say it. Don't memorize it word by word, otherwise it's going to come off as mechanically. The way I would practice it actually is I would call my mom and my friends walking home from my internship every day, junior year, and I'd be like, Devin, all right, ready? Another tell me about yourself. All right, go. And I would just tell it to them. And then I'd ask for feedback. And I'd do someone different every day with a different one until I had the right one. And the day I knew I had the right one, I knew it, and so did everyone else I was calling, because it was a story that sold myself and brought out the best in me. Next, keep it short and sweet. The ideal time is probably like 2-3 minutes. But as long as it's engaging, interesting, your interviewer is paying attention, you're not going over the time limit. As soon as you lose someone's interest, that's when you go over the time limit. Also, be energetic. There was a very stark difference between my bad example and my good example. And one of the reasons was just because the way I talked, the way I communicated, and how energetic and happy I was. So you want to have that same positivity about you. Another one is, don't go too deep into one experience. You don't want to dive really deep and talk about one thing a lot. It just takes off the point. If your interviewer really wants to hear about something, they'll ask. So that's what you're gonna do, is give a surface level view of kind of everything, then they can dig deeper. For example, what I do is I set my interviewer up. At the end of my good one, I say, I actually started my own business and sold it. that's going to be one of the last things that they remember. And it's going to be one of the most interesting things because they don't know a lot about it. They don't know what the business is. They don't know how it started. They don't know how much money I made. They want to know all these things, but I don't give it to them. And the reason is because I know that almost every single one of them is going to ask me as soon as I'm done, oh, what was your business? And then they're going to ask more and more questions. And the reason I do this is because I can answer every single question about my business. My goal is to keep them asking me about things that I do know about. So that way, that means there's less time for them to ask me things that I don't know about. And that's my strategy. So I do that because I want to drive the conversation. So whenever you can have that kind of control, that is what you want to do. And then you don't need to say everything. I've heard a lot of people that they'll be telling a story, they'll be like, oh, and I did this, but really it was my manager's idea and he did most of the work. I don't believe in lying, but you can exaggerate a little or just don't show all of your cards. And an example of this is kind of with my situation where I would go, oh, I studied business and computer science. I never lied. And if they asked me about it, I would tell the truth. But at the same time, kind of helps my case. So you don't need to reveal everything. And lastly, include interesting things about yourself at the end. I really like this because I think it personalizes me. It makes me different. Instead of being the other kid who interviewed for product management, I'm the sponsored snowboarder who did stand-up comedy. Like, that's crazy unique. And if you can find anything about yourself like that, that's what you want to include. Or things like I did with stand-up comedy and Eagle Scout that just, they convey certain attributes about you that are going to be really helpful for the job. So ultimately, these are the tips and rules that I crafted my Tell Me About Yourself response about. I hope you now understand that you really need to tell that story about why you're sitting there today and why you're going to be the best PM candidate. Because remember, there's thousands of other people competing against you, and this is going to be the portion where you can really personalize yourself and stand out, and you have the most control in the interview at this point in time. So remember, no one regrets preparing enough. I mean, too much, but people regret not preparing enough. So go out there and craft a killer Tell Me About Yourself.